In 2016, a Scottish police officer watched a family's dog land on top of a 7-foot hedge. It had been playing in the garden seconds before. No one could explain how it got there. Police Scotland confirmed the call. They never explained what caused it. Go back further, and a schoolgirl's desk lifts an inch off the floor in front of her entire class. Further still, a minister is struck in the head by a stone that flew from an empty room. And in a remote croft house, a row of teacups drop from their hooks, leaving the handles still hanging on the nails. 4 Scottish poltergeist cases. 4 unanswered questions. We start in 2016. Rutherglen is an historic town in South Lanarkshire, around 3 miles from Glasgow. In early August 2016, a mother and her teenage son were living an ordinary family life in their home on Stonelaw Road. It was a warm but very wet summer, and everything was going good until a few strange things began to happen. Lights flickered, and small objects seemed to shift from where they had been left to somewhere else. Poltergeist cases almost always live in memory and a person's testimony. They get passed down through the people who were there, with little beyond their word to go on. However, this case would turn out differently. Within days, what started as a handful of odd moments would escalate quickly and visibly enough to draw in outside witnesses with no reason to exaggerate what any of them saw. Police officers on duty were called to the same address twice in 2 days. That alone sets this case apart from almost every other haunting on record. The disturbances grew far too strange to dismiss. Clothes were seen flying across rooms with no one near them. A lampshade flipped upside down on its own. The oven door slammed shut, then swung open again, over and over, as though something unseen were testing it. Frightened and unable to explain what was happening in their own home, the mother and son called the police. The officers who responded expected the usual explanation: a domestic disturbance, or perhaps a family in the middle of a mental health crisis. What they found instead left several of them shaken. They watched clothing lift and travel across a room. They saw lights switch off and on, with no one near a switch. Candlesticks, lamps, and phones were seen shifting from place to place. The officers called in their superiors, expecting to be told they had misread the situation. Instead, more officers arrived, and more of them witnessed the same thing. Then came the detail that would define the entire case. The family's small chihuahua had been let outside, playing in the garden as it always did. When someone went to check on it, the dog was found sitting on top of a 7-foot garden hedge, calm and unharmed, with no way of having climbed there on its own. No one could explain how it got up there. Police Scotland later confirmed that officers had attended the property on the 8th and 9th of August, and that there was no evidence of any criminal activity. It remains one of the only times a British police force has gone on record about something so difficult to explain. The devoutly Catholic family turned to their local priest, who came to the house and performed a blessing. For a short while, it seemed to help, but by then, the mother and son had already decided they couldn't stay. They packed what they needed and moved in with relatives, leaving the house on Stonelaw Road behind. In the time since, no further disturbances have been reported there. Some have suggested the old mine workings underground might explain strange currents of air moving through the house. It's a theory that struggles to explain how a small dog ended up 7 feet off the ground. The house still stands today. What happened inside it that August has never been explained, and no one has ever come forward to say it happened again. On the western edge of the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides, sits the small township of Tolster, Charolais. In the winter of 1938, an elderly woman named Mrs. MacLeod lived there in a stone croft house called Carn Dubh, sharing her home with her teenage granddaughter and her young grandson, still a toddler. The house was quiet, ordinary, and much like every other croft along that windswept coast. On the last Sunday morning of January, the 3 of them sat together by the stove, drinking tea, the same as they had every morning. Life at Carn Dubh followed the typical familiar way of island life. There was no history of trouble in the house, no old tragedy attached to its walls, nothing in its past to explain what was about to happen. What made that morning different has never been fully understood. A lump of burning peat is said to have landed in Mrs. MacLeod's cup of tea, and moments later, another struck her cheek. It might have been dismissed as a stray ember from the stove, if what followed had not made that explanation impossible. Once her granddaughter opened the door between the kitchen and the next room, the disturbances grew far stranger. Cups hanging by their handles on nails along the wall began dropping to the floor and smashing one after another, though no one stood near them. Some left their handles still hanging neatly on the nails, as if the cups themselves had simply let go. A jug lifted from its place and drifted nearly 10 feet through the air before settling gently onto a bed without spilling a drop of what was inside it. A bar of soap and a wooden toothbrush snapped cleanly in two, as though cut by something sharp, though nothing was seen to touch them. Word of the strange events quickly reached the village, and a local writer, known for documenting island stories, arrived with the parish librarian to see it for themselves. Neither man believed in ghosts, and both approached the house expecting to find a simple human explanation. What they found instead was a frightened family and a room full of broken crockery that none of them could account for. Through it all, Mrs. MacLeod's young grandson showed no fear at all. Too small to understand what was happening, he laughed and clapped at each new object that flew past him, delighted by what looked to him like a game. It was the adults in the room who grew pale, watching a small child smile at something they could not explain. The most unsettling incidents happened when crockery shattered mid-air, even when every person in the room stood still. The activity did not build toward any single dramatic peak, the way a ghost story might promise. Instead, it simply continued, unpredictably, for weeks, fading in and out through the early months of 1938, before finally going quiet again in the late spring, as suddenly and as inexplicably as it had begun. No one ever determined a cause. The visiting writer, skeptical from the start, went looking for a rational answer, and later suggested the strange electrical charge, sometimes found in old stone houses along that coast, might explain flying objects and shattering cups, though even he admitted it could not account for everything the family described. Mrs. MacLeod never left the house. Despite everything that happened beneath its roof, she continued to live there for the rest of her life, seemingly unbothered by what other households might have called a haunting. Years later, a different family moved into the same house, with no knowledge of what had happened there in 1938. They, too, reported hearing sounds in the night that they could never explain, sounds with no obvious source and no obvious end. In the autumn of 1960, 11-year-old Virginia Campbell moved from a remote corner of County Donegal in Ireland to live with her 30-year-old brother's family in Sauchie, a small mining town near Alloa in Scotland. Her parents were finishing the sale of their farm back home and would join her later. On her first night in the house on Park Crescent, Virginia shared a bed with her 9-year-old niece, Margaret. It was an ordinary night, in an ordinary council house, until a sound began beneath the bed. Virginia had left behind the only home she'd known, a quiet croft on the Irish coast, to live with relatives in a busy Scottish town while her parents settled their affairs. She was managing a lot of change at once, a new country, a new house, and a family she didn't see every day. None of this explains what happened next, but it's the only context anyone has ever been able to offer for why the disturbances centered on her specifically, rather than anyone else in the house. The first sound was a steady thumping under the bed, like a ball bouncing on the floor. Virginia and Margaret switched on the light and found nothing there, so they went downstairs to tell the family. The sound followed them, thumping through the house until Virginia finally fell asleep from exhaustion. The next day, still shaken, she stayed home from school. At tea time, while she sat in a chair, a sideboard beside her slid 5 inches from the wall, then slid back. That night, the knocking grew loud enough that neighbours heard it. A local minister was called out of bed to see for himself. He placed his hand on the headboard and felt it vibrating with each knock. In the same room, a heavy linen chest, over 2 feet long and full of bedding, rocked, lifted slightly off the floor, and slid 18 inches across the linoleum before settling back into place. The following night, a doctor watched Virginia's pillow rotate and slide out from beneath her head while she lay in bed, and heard a soaring sound coming from inside her linen basket, with no explanation for either. On Friday the 25th of November, Virginia returned to school for the afternoon. During a period of silent reading, her teacher, Margaret Stewart, saw Virginia struggling to hold down the lid of her desk, which kept forcing itself open against her strength. Minutes later, Miss Stewart watched an empty desk behind Virginia rise slowly until it hung about an inch off the floor, then settled gently back down, slightly out of its original position. She checked the desk herself afterward. There were no strings, no wires, nothing to explain how it had moved. In the days that followed, the disturbances continued at school in front of other children and staff. A heavy teacher's desk lifted off the ground, a blackboard pointer vibrated and rolled off a desk on its own, and a bowl of hyacinth bulbs slid across a surface with no one touching it. Virginia stood in front of her teacher in tears, insisting she hadn't touched anything. The case drew the attention of Dr. George Owen, a parapsychologist at Trinity College, Cambridge, who interviewed the witnesses directly and later published his findings. He concluded the disturbances most likely originated from Virginia herself, during a period of emotional strain and physical development, rather than from any outside presence, though he admitted there was no way to identify or measure whatever force might have been involved. By the following spring, the disturbances faded and stopped entirely. Virginia moved with her family to the Midlands in England, grew up, married, and largely left the experience behind her. Asked about it years later, she said it had never truly frightened her, but that for the sake of others, she hoped it wouldn't happen again. In February 1695, a farmer named Andrew Mackey lived with his family at Ringcroft of Stocking, in the parish of Galloway, southwest Scotland. The trouble began not with a sound or a sighting, but with something buried. Years earlier, the previous tenant of the land, a man named McNaught, had reportedly consulted someone with second sight, who warned him that a tooth was buried beneath the doorstep slab of the house and needed to be removed. McNaught's son was meant to pass that warning on to whoever took over the land next, but he was conscripted before he ever delivered it. By the time Andrew Mackey and his family moved in, no one had removed anything from beneath that slab, and no one living there knew it was there at all. For a time, nothing seemed unusual. Then Mackey's cattle began appearing untied in the morning, despite having been secured the night before, and in some cases were found retied in configurations that made no obvious sense, as though someone had walked through the byre in the dark without ever being seen or heard. It was strange enough to unsettle the household, but not yet dangerous. That changed quickly. A pile of burning peat was found set inside the house itself, with no clear source for how it had gotten there or caught alight. Soon after, stones began flying through the rooms, striking walls, furniture, and eventually people. The family called in the parish minister, Alexander Telfair, to pray with them, and during one of these sessions, a stone struck him directly in the head, drawing blood in front of the gathered household. On another occasion, the children in the house were confronted by what looked like a seated figure in the dark, only to discover it was a stool draped in a blanket, arranged deliberately to resemble a person watching them. The disturbances reached their most severe point during a prayer session inside the family's cowshed. Witnesses reported a disembodied white arm reaching out and gripping the minister as he prayed, accompanied by a voice warning the household to repent. Telfair himself later wrote that a voice told him, "Take you that," in the moment the stones struck him. During the same gathering, several present described a black mass or cloud that seemed to fill the space, thick enough that people in the room struggled to see one another. Shortly afterward, the family finally lifted the doorstep slab and found bones, along with flesh and blood wrapped in paper, buried beneath it, exactly where the psychic had warned years before. They handed the remains to Minister Telfair, and from that point on, the attacks stopped. The Mackey family stayed on the land for a time, but the house eventually burned down. Today, nothing remains on the site of Ringcroft of Stocking except a single dead tree, standing where the house once stood. 4 houses, 4 families, 3 centuries apart, and not one of them ever got a clear answer. A grandmother who stayed in her home despite the broken cups. A farmer who found what was buried and watched the stones stop. A schoolgirl whose desk lifted in front of a room full of witnesses, never fully explained even by the scientist who studied her case for years. A mother and son who left their home in 2016 and never came back. In a case a police force went on record about, but never solved. What connects them isn't proof. It's the fact that in each case, ordinary people, doctors, ministers, teachers, and officers all say the same thing. They saw something they couldn't explain, and no one has explained it since. So, what do you think? Let me know your opinion in the comments. Thank you for joining me, and I wish you a good day or a good night wherever you are watching from. Remember, sleep well, but keep one eye open, as you never know who is watching from the shadows.